the same deal from women, or they seek the same things from women. But what I hear there is my career is now part of my identity.
Shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing? Welcome back to Reading with SHILO. It's SHILO, man. Here on Boot Soldier 337. And we're here for the next section, man. We're about to read the next two sections of the chapter 10 of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. History of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. So if you're new to the channel, hey, as I'm reading, if I come across words I don't know, I will write them down and look them up. So we're going to take a pause for the cause for that. We'll keep pushing. It's going to be since it's two sections, it's going to probably be about an hour read. I'll try to push through. Yeah. We'll read section 2 and section 3 of Literary Reflections, chapter 10. Chapter 10 of On the Real Side, which has shown itself to be more history than comedy. It's definitely telling. It's definitely telling of the great lengths that a lot of comedians had to go through to get to where we are, which is great. I was just hoping that the book was gonna have more laughter, more funny stuff in the book. But whether it does or not, we're gonna keep pushing. We're gonna keep pushing and move through the book until we finish, man. And look at that, man. We are doing good. I think we're doing good. This book was a big one. Man, hold up. When I put that bottle, I might need it. All right, let's jump into it, man. So come on in. Tell your friend, tell your kin. You might want a paper and a pen. Yeah. Section 2. Section 2. Now, Francis Harper's Iola Leroy in 1892 and J. McHenry Jones' Hearts of Gold in 1896 were among the earliest examples of the accommodationist or apologist fiction, a genre that extolled the virtues of decent blacks and appealed to America's sense of justice and race relations. Now, in contrast with Sutton Griggs' Imperium in Imperio in 1899, an example of nationalistic or militant fiction in which the separatist hero plots to take over of Texas, and The Hindered Hand in 1905, which the critic Addison Gale Jr. describes as one man's attempt to combat the malicious propaganda of his time. Both creative strains were reactions to the post-Reconstruction oppression and the derogatory portrait of Negroes presented by white writers. The propagandist intent of most of these works is clear, but ultimately they were no more tendentious. Let's see what it is. Tendentious. They are no more tendentious TEN tendentious 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 TENDENT tendentious.
Tendentious.
I was right. Tendentious expressing or intending to promote a particular cause or point of view, especially a controversial one. Oh, yeah, and that propaganda was controversial. The propagandist intent of most of these works is clear, but ultimately they were no more tendentious than the works to which they reacted. Still, they were generally less art than in treatment, and as such usually floundered in melodramatics and rhetorical excess. The mainstream literature of the early 20th century, humor was widespread and much of it employed the traditional figure of the wise fool or the common man. By this time, however, the image of the ordinary black man had been appropriated by mainstream culture and presented as a genuine fool, a common man without common sense. The image of the craven, irresponsible, ignorant Negro buffoon was by then a national symbol. Only a literary wizard could have overcome the social and political obstacles of the time and supplanted that image with one of the wise Black American Socrates. Now, most early 20th century Black writers simply avoided humor as a literary technique and followed W.E.B. Du Bois's suggestion to abandon the comic depiction of Negroes. But there were also more subtle reasons for African American writers to eschew humor. The post Reconstruction era's stepped up repression had deflated much of the optimism and expectations blacks had felt after emancipation. Black Americans had to define themselves in a chaotic climate in which the professed ideals of the nation and its social reality were diametrically opposed. More of the most educated and vocal members of the race, the emerging middle class, were more from the relatively small group of formerly free Negroes and were at least half white. Now, miscegenation, as Clodagh suggests, was far more common than society wished to acknowledge. And many of the progeny of those typically clandestine interminglings were unwilling to accept society's arbitrary racial division. They sought a classification based on education and cultural achievements, not merely on race or, more precisely, on discernible appearance of color. At the turn of the century, they were still joking or jockeying for the position of the social ladder. Strong appeals for a closing of ranks among all those identified as Negroes did not occur until the teens. The unreconciled strivings and anxious observance of self through the eyes of others, of which Du Bois wrote, derived, at least partially, from the black elite's identification with mainstream America and the desire to distance itself from the black masses. Their self appraisal was reflected in the apologists or the accommodationist camp of writers, as well as in the lack of outpouring of humor based on racial polarization. Although the ability to observe oneself with some degree of detachment is most often the prerequisite for humor, the comic impulse rarely coexists with hesitancy, passivity, and self consciousness. It is an art of the bravado personality, as one critic noted. Even when it arises out of the underlying sense of insecurity, it issues most effectively from an assumed position of eminence and self assurance based on some real or imagined trait, such as physical power or prowess, social status, or intellectual or moral superiority. Whether stoked by irreverence or self righteousness, as the satirists such as H.L. Mencken and Jonathan Swift, or nourished by worldliness or underdogs' eyes for contradiction and precision, as with, say, George Bernard Shaw and Will Rogers, humor reflects an aggression or aggressive thrust or ascendancy. It may assume the guise of modesty and self effacement, as with comics such as Stephen Wright and Woody Allen, but even then, At minimum, it still extols and celebrates the perspicuity of that viewpoint. Perhaps most often, humor is seldom natural. Sometimes or something is nearly always the object of ridicule, the butt of the joke. America, at the turn of the century, however, did not offer Black writers the kind of popular support and security that usually girds political and social satire. Without that support, the assertiveness and self assuredness required for a humorous posture could not easily develop among African American writers. Now, Charles Waddell Chestnut was one of the few early 20th century African American writers who made humor a prominent element in his fiction. Generally, his short stories far outstrip his novels in literary merit, and perhaps not coincidentally, he used the comic approach less sparingly in those stories. The tales collected in The Conjure Woman in 1899, for instance, revolve around Chestnut's Uncle Julius, a character who bears some surface resemblance to Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus, but is actually a sly trickster whose obsequiousness masks his efforts on behalf of other slaves. And The Wife of His Youth in 1899, also a collection of sketches and stories, includes one of Chestnut's most bittingly humorous tales. In The Passing of Grandson or Grandison, a plantation patriarch's son attempts to win the hand of Charity, the young woman whom he is courting, by demonstrating his boldness and independence, traits he decides to display by freeing one of his father's slaves. Now, Dick Owen convinces his father that he needs a servant for a trip to the north, then sets off to Boston with the intention of simply allowing the slave to wander off. His companion is Grandison, an elderly servant whose wise subordination and loyal dependence is unquestioned, and who, according to the patriarch, is too fond of good eating to risk losing his regular meals. In a hilarious comic turnabout, Chestnut recounts the young master's attempt to first allow Grandison to escape by his own initiative. He gives him money and leaves him alone for long periods, then introduces him to abolitionists. But Grandison spurns the opportunities and instead repudiates the abolitionists and the free Negroes that he meets. They're different from the niggas down on the highway. They loathe this free, but they ain't got sense enough to know they ain't half as well off as they would be down south, where they'd be depreciated. Now, finally, at his wits' end, Owens takes the slave to Canada and simply abandons him. Owens returns to the South alone, and although his father is outraged at the loss of his chattel, marries Charity. Now, shortly after the marriage, however, a ragged, weary Grandison makes his way back home. Ecstatic at Grandison's return, the patriarchy lionizes his faithful nigger and rewards him with his escape from the lonesome abolitionist by giving him special concessions and making his life a slave's dream come true. 3 weeks later, the slaveholder discovers that Grandison is again missing. This time, however, the slave's wife, mother, father, brothers, and sisters are gone also. The tale ends as the elder Owen stands on the shore of Lake Erie shaking his fist as Grandison and his family wave from a steamboat headed from Canada. The Passing of Grandison combines broad comedy, wily deception, and ironic understatement. Chestnut revealed a similar comic sensibility in many of his other tales, often revising the popular use of dialect so that it reflected Black ingenuity rather than confirming their assumed ignorance. The novelist and critic George or John Edgar Whitman notes that Black speech in the form of Negro dialect entered American literature as a curiosity, a comic interlude, a shorthand for perpetuating myths and prejudices about black people. Now, Weidman underscores Chestnut's successful use of the African American oral tradition with its double meanings, its tonal definitions, and capacity to talk behind the victim's back while looking him in the face. The story Weidman analyzes, A Deep Sleeper, features Uncle Julius and revolves around the trickster theme, the narrator's recounting of a tale told by Uncle Julius co- uh, corroborates white exceptions about or expectations about Negro behavior on the surface, but actually buys time for Uncle Julius and his cohorts to accomplish their own ends. As in the passing of Grandison, the tale employs ironic comic inversion, reversing the traditional derogatory use of black dialect to give its black characters the last laugh. Now, few contemporary black writers use dialect and ironic humor as effectively or subtly as Chestnut. Irony was most often turned to the tragic or occasionally the tragicomic end. In novels about passing or crossing the color line, for example, irony appears repeatedly, but usually as a device to garner sympathy for mixed blood protagonists seeking their proper place in society. It was seldom employed to ridicule the inherent absurdity of the system that perpetuated the irrational black white schism and societal pretense. Protagonists who appeared white, but either knew or found out about their Negro backgrounds, were inevitably portrayed as serious souls who accepted social custom as fixed reality. Excuse me, hold on. Now, tragedy accepts the flaw in the world as it is. The critic Wiley Cipher writes, then ventures to find nobility in the inexorable march of actual situations. In many early black novels, Negro blood becomes a tragic flaw that ultimately consumes and destroys its near white possessors. Unlike the comic hero, who quickly changes one mask from another and is capable of playing various roles with gusto, those piteous mulattoes are unable to escape their fate. They accept their misfortune and responsibility with a stoic face. No trickster mulattoes emerge in these stories. No semi black false stuff who could move unrestrictedly in both worlds, thumbing his nose at the underling idiocy of the static racial concept. Characters of these novels are devoid of comic vision, a heightened consciousness of the duplicity of existence. Instead, somber melancholy marked the raft of tragic mulatto novels in which the delusioned hero or heroine, like William Wells Brown's Clottle, usually perished. Now, Brown's Clottle, Harper's Iola Leroy, and Chestnut's The House Behind the Cedars in 1900 are early examples of the genre. But the theme remained popular in fiction by blacks and whites well into the 20th century. The autobiography of an ex-colored man in 1912 was one of the few novels that treated the passing theme with some humor and ironic distance. Its author, James Wendell Johnson, who was noted before had collaborated with his brother Rosamond in writing theatrical comedies, disclosed his intent when, in the first paragraph, he had the nameless first person narrator announce, I know that I am playing with fire, and I feel the thrill which accompanies that most fascinating pastime. And back of it all, I think I find a sort of savage and diabolical desire to gather up all the little tragedies of my life and turn them into a practical joke on society. At one time, After the protagonist has infiltrated white society, he comments, "When I return to my room after an enjoyable evening, I laugh heartily over what struck me as the capital joke I was playing." Now, Johnson's approach, however, was not typical. Most African American writers treated the ironic circumstances of black life humorously. W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folks, for instance, includes The Coming of John, a story dealing with a young black college student returned to his rural Georgia hometown. Before his departure, John was a source of pride to the black community. He was even liked by white folks, although they insisted college would spoil him and thought of John basically as good natured and respectful, a fine plowhand. After he comes back, even every step he made offended someone. His education has left him out of touch with family and former friends, and his uppity bearing angers whites. The situation is rife with ironic implications, but it is turned to what Blythe Jackson calls uneasy laughter. The very reaction of the ironist that suffices nearly all black literature. Instead of exploring the comic nuances of the character's predicament, the alternative to tragic self humiliation, annihilation, Dubois focuses on tragic defeat. He opted for the fictional approach that demands a law of necessity or destiny within whose confines the hero is given to sacrifice or death. As the tale ends, John is a forlorn, alienated figure facing the coiling, twisted rope. Or The Coming of John is a typical example of a direction that the small group of serious early black writers took in depicting the black experience prior to the 1920s. Their desire to be taken seriously generally precluded the use of humor as a central literary technique. The talented 10th writers, overwhelming choice of tragedy over humor or comedy made perfect sense, given their goal of clearly dramatizing the disastrous consequences of racism, the human misery that it inevitably provoked. Tragedy is a closed form of art, with a single, fixed, and contained meaning. Somehow it shows what must happen, even while there comes a shock of unsurmised disaster. In contrast, comedy is more complex and often less exacting. It embraces contradiction, chaos, and the irrational. It penetrates the surface, our civilized masks, and reveals the prodigal and absurd. As Parandello suggested, it notes the contradictions between the body and its shadows. But ironically, the talented 10th writer's insistence on tragic portrayal not only further separated their work from their laughter and more humanized existence experienced by most Black Americans, but by casting Blacks solely in the role of victims in some way affirms the authenticity, or at least the efficiency of the belief in racial destiny they struggle to eradicate. The more satirical approach might have more vividly revealed the inherent absurdity of America's racial arrangements. But the upsurge of such writing would not occur until African American writers abandoned their stuff, middle class formality, and more honestly embraced the perspective of folk humor and of the Black masses. That was section 2. Section 3. Now, in the 20s, middle class apologists, for whom the popular primitive stereotype of the period was as reprehensible as the ignorant darky image of earlier times, continued producing works depicting starch, bourgeois types who exemplified traditional values and the Protestant ethic. A few others adapted to the satirical spirit of such mainstream writers as H.L. Mencken and Sinclair Lewis, and evoked an underlying vitality and sense of im- im- impiousness and irony that most often had been suggested only in literary portraits of free spirited urban blacks. In fact, they abandoned exaggerated, surface caricature but retained the cynical disregard for the mainstream priorities. They also increasingly turned to black folk humor and satire as expressive tools in their literary works. James Weldon Johnson, an admirer of H.L. Mencken, reflected the shift in his New York Age column in 1922. When he wrote that some aspects of the race question were as so absurd that they cannot be effectively treated except in a satirical manner. He was not the first black writer to advocate a satirical response to bigotry, or in fact to use satire in attacking the blatant contradictions between slavery and Jim Crowism and democracy. There were some examples in slave narratives, notably in the Frederick Douglass autobiographies and in anti slave pamphlets. For instance, in his famous appeal, published in 1829, David Walker referred to a South Carolina newspaper that juxtaposed an article claiming that the Turks were the most barbarous people in the world and excoriating that them from treating the Greeks more like brutes than human beings, with notices promoting the sale of African Americans and offering rewards for the return of runaways. It is really so funny to hear Southerners and Westerners of this country talk about barbarity, Walker wrote. That it is positively enough to make a man smile. And by the early 18th or 20th century, cartoons and editorials in black newspapers regularly used satire in emphasizing the irreconcilability of America's racial policy and its humanitarian pretensions. In 1918, for example, Robert S. Abbott, the editor of the Chicago Defender, wrote in Swiftian fashion, "Who knows, but there may be such a thing as refined mob, composed of colonels, Southern aristocracy, and the ever-present best citizens. Who knows, after seeing their work, that they have improved on the art of torture practiced in savage life and made it more fiendish." Johnson, however, was advocating the use of satire and humor not only in expository works, but also in poetry, drama, and fiction. Now, although there were exceptions, Langston Hughes and County Cullen among them, the black poets of the 20s did not produce an abundance of humorous verse. Novelists responded to Johnson's exhortations more favorably, and the Harlem Renaissance ultimately produced the first notable African American writers to employ humor as the central element of their work. Their politics differed widely, but before the Renaissance ground to a halt in the 30s, three satirists and two significant folk humorists had emerged. Now, George Schuler was the most prominent satirist as well as the most controversial of the Renaissance writers. He too was an admirer of Mencken, who encouraged him to satirize whites as well as blacks. And while Mencken was editor in 1924 to 1933, Schuler appeared more frequently in American Mercury than any other contributor. Excuse me. Like his mentor, he was a versatile iconoclast whose barbed wit found a vast array of targets. In his column for the Pittsburgh Courier, the articles for the Messenger, and the American Mercury, he expectedly satirized Nordics and the United States in articles such as "Our White Folks," "Blessed Are the Sons of Ham," and "Our Greatest Gift to America, The recurring theme in these articles was the inherent idiocy of race as a tenable social concept and white America's unlimited ability to delude itself. Since he debunked the entire concept of race, he also pillarized the notion of black art and ridiculed black nationalists and racial apologists. The logical extension of his unbending, rare view of race as total myth would, by the 50s, cast him as a right wing outsider whose opposition to liberal social programs and the civil rights movement isolated him from the central drift of African American thought. Schuler's two novels, Slaves Today and Black No More, both published in 1931, reflected his basic intellectual and satirical concerns. The former targets the Republican or the Republic of Liberia, skewering the political and social order established by Negroes from America. Its theme, as one critic described it, is that with regard to cruelty and exploitation, repression and oppression, blacks are in one with whites throughout the world. There are some amusing comic turns to the satire in this work, but the novel is so heavy handed and Schuler's depiction of the black leaders' villainy so unrelenting that the satire lapses into farce, burlesque, and bludgeoning realism. As another critic notes, the leader of the country are portrayed as if they had taken a correspondence course in civic government from the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. They project the very irrationality of evil itself. Black No More is a more balanced and humorous sample of Schuler's satire. Set in America, the tale concerns the discovery of the process that turns blacks into Caucasians in 3 days and comically details the social effects of the mass transformation. It is an occasion for Schuler to lampoon racial bigotry, false racial pride, and a raft of scarcely veiled race leaders, both black and white. A white supremacy organization is led by the Reverend Henry Givens, who had finished the 8th grade in a one-room country school, but holds his flock spellbound with explanations of the laws of heredity and other scientific subjects. A Garvey-like character named Santop Licorice is a leader of the Back to Africa movement, but owns a fleet of ships that had never been to Africa. He never had but one cargo, and that, being gin, was half consumed by the unpaid and thirsty crew before the vessel was saved by the coastal guard. And the Dubois, like Dr. Shakespeare, Agamemnon Beard writes editorials for The Dilemma, denouncing the Caucasians, whom he secretly admired, and lauding the greatness of the Negroes, whom he alternately pitied and despised. It is a direct let's see what it is. Solvane. It is a direct sol because it's 2 words, that's why. It is a direct salvo aimed at the myth of race and all those whom, from Schuler's perspective, profit by it. Fittingly, at the conclusion, it is discovered that the Negroes who have undergone the Black No More treatment are a shade lighter than regular Caucasians. Whiteness becomes the measure of inferiority, and the insanity continues. Despite his absolute rejection of race as a legitimate social concept and the ensuing criticism of his work, George Schuler establishes himself as the leading black satirist, a racial label, by the way, that he would have emphatically rejected. His rational and objective view of the racial problem placed him in the outer edge of what can be called African American humor. But his lively deflation of the assumptions that issued from advocates of both sides of the racial myth gave him the unique standing as a black satirist. The most relevant criticism of Schuler's work concerned his dismissal of actual cultural differences that occurred from segregation and the entrenched belief in race. In articles such as Negro Art Hokum, Schuler leaned towards arguing that there were no cultural differences between blacks and whites. That underlying belief may well account for the near absence of African American folk humor in his work. Other writers of the period avoided that exclusion. Consequently, their work was buoyed by a richer as well as less pristine and intellectual humor. Wallace Thurman and Rudolph Fisher were the other two prominent black satirists of the period. In both The Blacker the Berry in 1929 and Infants of the Spring in 1930, Thurman turned his sardonic wit inward toward the black community. The title of his first novel is based on the folks saying the blacker the berry, the sweeter juice, and indicates the direction the tale takes. Through the frustration and exploitation of Emma Lou, the novel's beautiful, intelligent, and dark-skinned heroine, Thurman enacts a bitterly satiric expose of blacks' hypocrisy regarding color prejudice amongst themselves. Although the humor is low-key, it is a refreshing antidote to the tragic mulatto theme. In Infants of the Spring, Thurman, like Schuler, turned his barbs toward his fellow Renaissance artists. His scathing description of the bohemian gatherings at Nigarati Manor is punctuated by satiric portraits of actual Renaissance figures, who fare no better than Dr. Beard and Mr. Licorice in Schuler's novel. Now, overall, Thurman's satire is grim in the extreme and representative of black humor, more in the generic literacy or literary sense than in the racial one. The thrust of both novels is tragic rather than comic. And again, like Schuler, as an elitist and intellectual, Thurman is only faintly concerned with the folksy but richly transcendent humor of the black masses. Now, in The Walls of Jericho in 1928, and The Conjure Man dies in 1932, Rudolph Fisher moved closer to incorporating the rhythms and tones of black street humor. The critic Addison Gale Jr. concludes that of the Renaissance writers, he is the comic novelist, a forerunner of Ralph Ellison and Ishmael Reed. Fisher's The Conjure Man Dies is recognized as the first detective story by the African American author, and like Fisher's earlier novel, is infused with the language and comic spirit of the ordinary black who frequents barbershops, juke joints, and pool rooms. There is a touch of romantic primitivism in this novel, but unlike the exaggerated, carefree exotics who appeared in many Renaissance novels, most of Fisher's folks are genuine people whose concerns go beyond dance, drink, and sex. The plot is centered on the investigation of a murder in Harlem and features two of Fisher's most amusing comic characters, Jinx Jenkins and Bubba Brown. The antics of Jinx and Bubba are first-rate slapstick. Sterling Brown observes, and through traces of Octavius Roy Cohen appear most of the comedy in close to Harlem sidewalks. Now, Jinx and Bubba had also appeared on The Walls of Jericho, Fisher's most expansive and successful balanced satire of Harlem life. Here, they join a cast of characters ranging from Harlem's dicties or upper crust to the patrons of Patmore's pool parlor, where you meet real regular guys and rub elbows with authority. Among the regular guys are Jinx and Bubba. furniture movers who spice the tale with the barrage of street raps, jargon, and jibes. Although they are funny in speaking black urban dialect, Fisher seldom loses sight of their humanity. They are neither over-antic coons nor dim-witted darkies. Instead, their bantering and signifying provide a glimpse of humorous spirit grounded in a realistic street perspective that acknowledges black peripheral status in the white world but concentrates on the tangible enjoyment of their present position. Faz done sees, Phase don't done sees no difference. 20 dicty shines and any kind o' shines. Bubba tells Jinx. One jig in danger is every jig in danger. A moment later, after Jinx come close to slipping into the dozens, they are nearly ready to fight. But despite being edged on by the crowd, the two friends settle their differences when Jinx assures Bubba, ain't nobody studying your family. In this exchange, and elsewhere in the novel, Fisher interrogates the folks' wisdom of ordinary blacks with their fondness for jest and verbal play. He was one of the first African American authors to portray the humor of the common, urban black man without distorting it with a veneer of insistent self ridicule or an infusion of a romantic guff about noble primitives and flight into a world of sensuous music, drink, and dark passions. Now, Fisher was notably a satirist, however, and the walls of Jericho intertwines portraits of lower class blacks with ironic and satirical observations of Harlem's during the 20s. There is a devastating depiction of the white philanthropist Miss Agatha Cramp, who had been devoting her life to mankind, but had regarded Negroes as rather ugly but serviceable fixtures. Her black maid's beauty produces a, epitome, epiphany, produces an epiphany, after which the startling possibility occurred to her that Negroes might be mankind too. There are also satiric portraits of General Improvement Association, the NAACP ball, impressionable whites who come uptown to see the niggas, and of Harlem's black elite. Among the latter is Fred Merritt, one of the first trickster mulattoes to emerge in American fiction. Although downright rabid on things racial, he passes back and forth over the color line, using his access to buy property in the segregated neighborhood, or in a more ironic vein, to twit the gullible Miss Cramp, who is convinced he is white. Nobody laughs at the miseries of life like the Negro, he tells her. He accepts things not with resignation, but with amusement. How could you wound a fellow who simply laughed? How could you be sure what he was laughing at? Himself, maybe. But I know I'd begin to think he might be laughing at me. In that and similar passages, Fisher explored the areas of put on and sham that are the natural consequences of America's absurd racial posture, and therefore the special province of African American humor merit as lawyer, black man, white man, imposter, and ultimately trickster and race man was the embodiment of this absurdity. Along with Jinx and Bubba, he symbolized the humor and assertiveness of the new Negro in a manner that was not seen or heard in movies or in the theater, on records or radio, or in the works of the Renaissance writers. The Wall of Jericho provides a genuine look at authentic African American humor long before it reached the mainstream. And Fisher was the first Negro to write social comedy. And The Walls of Jericho was the most resonant, and revealing comic novel produced by a Renaissance writer. He was, if not in fact, at least in the opinion of Langston Hughes, also the wittiest of these new Negroes of Harlem. His tongue was flavored with the sharpest and saltiest humor. Still, he fell short of Zora Neale Hurston and Hughes in bringing genuine folk humor to Black literature. And that was section 3. That was section 2 and section 3 of chapter 10 of On the Real Side. Literary reflections. Hooey, man. Who? I said about an hour. 45 minutes is was under an hour, so that's good. This chapter has, let me see, section 4, section 5, section 6. This section has 6 sections. I mean, this chapter has 6 sections. Then we got 11, 12, and 13. Man, we almost down, man. Ooh, chapter 11. Section 1 gonna be long. But that's it. Then it jumps. It's section 1, maybe it's section 2. But anyway, we're almost done. Man, I feel like I was kind of struggling, man. I feel like I was reading a lot of run-on sentences and whatnot. But despite all that, we pushed through one word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time until we finish the book and I can give my bookmark a line, man. But we'll get it. We'll keep pushing. You know, for all those that stayed, you know, Miss Boxy, thank you, man. Like the stream. For all the newcomers that come in later on and catch it on the back end, man, like, comment. You know, the likes definitely help the channel. Comments help the channel as well. So please, if you don't mind, those are free. Both of them are free. And I started this marking system, man, so I can try to stay on. I got it from my children. So I can try to stay on board with the readings. So every day that I read like I'm supposed to, I'm gonna give myself a sticker, man. I'm on 6. I'm on 6. I got one for my workout. I got one for the reading. I got one for my boys' schooling. And we're gonna keep pushing. Keep pushing, man. One book at a time. One book at a time, man. One day, man, this little boy that read, he wasn't even 5. He read 1,000 books. And I'm nowhere near there yet. But shit, if he can read 1,000 books, I can read 1,000. Well, even though I know them books may have been, you know, I don't know how them books were. They may have been small books, you know, to me, big books to him. Who knows? But the point is, he read them. He read them all. And I'm trying to get to a point to where I can say I've read a great number, and not only read, but can retain, comprehend, regurgitate, clarify. And be able to develop good opinions based on the information that has been given in the many books by the many authors. You know, which there are many. There are as many authors and books probably as there are the sands of the seas. That's why, you know, the making of many books, there is no end, as the scripture says. So, hey, and I'm trying not to get caught up in reading so many books, because sometimes, you know, you read stuff, it can take you to different places. And, you know, if your foundation not strong in whatever belief system you have, the books you read may alter your thought patterns and alter your preface on the things that you think, you know, so which in turn will cause you to alter your life and could fuck it up completely or can make it better, you know. But that's why I ask, in the description. What can we learn and grow from in these chapters or in these books? Maybe it is something that is meant, to teach us something. Maybe it's something that is meant to cause us to self-reflect and make adjustments if possible. Maybe it is. Who knows? Hopefully it does. Hopefully it helps you better your life. But I know for me, reading does, as much as I hate to admit it, reading to y'all, I should say, has become kind of therapeutic for me. So I feel funny and I feel bad when I don't read. I feel like, man, so I'm glad I've gotten to that point. The objective is to keep pushing and see what's the next point to get to. On the road to becoming a great reader, quick reader, uh, 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 a reader who can pronounce the words or pronounce the words correctly, as well as read it with emphasis, tonation, uh, uh, um, enthusiasm, and still be understood. As if I want to be able to read it as if I was just speaking. You know, but we'll get there. We'll get there. Like I said, one word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time. But that was it. That was it for section 2 and section 3 of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. A lot of history. A lot of history. Way more history than I thought it was going to give. Yes, it does say a history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. Keyword history. But I thought it would have a lot more laughter than it does. A lot more laughter than history. But either way, it's still, excuse me, still good info. Still good info. Still some great info, man. A lot of stuff I didn't know. I'm coming across stuff that I did know, and it's tying it into a lot of things that make it make a lot more sense to me. I can see the picture a lot clearer. But thank y'all, man. Whoever is in here rocking with me, let's keep pushing. We're moving on our way to 600 subscribers and trying to push past that to get to 1,000, man. 1,000. That's a big deal for me. 1,000 shit. 600 is a big deal. 600 subscribers is a big deal. I thank everybody who's subscribed and helped me get to almost to this point. Let's keep pushing and make the 600 as the first. That's the first cap, and then or the first stump or speed bump. The first speed bump to encounter, or the first goal, I should say, 600, and we're almost there. We may be like, I want to say we're 12 people short, 12 subscribers short from 600, and then we can go ahead and push to 1,000, man. Push to 1,000. But until next time, man, I hope y'all enjoyed it. SHILO out, man. I hope y'all have a wonderful night, evening, morning, afternoon, whenever it is that you get a chance to see this. Shalom.